Welcome to the Original Self Podcast. I'm Evet DeCota, owner of DeCota Life Coaching and a psychology-informed life coach exploring resilience, mindset, and the courage to become your authentic self. This is a space for honest conversations about growth, identity, relationships, and all the messy moments in between that shape who we become. Between the salon chair and coaching sessions, I've watched people move through life in patterns they rarely notice. Patterns that are subtle, familiar, and incredibly hard to see from the inside. Last time, in episode 19, we discussed how biology and generational patterns shaped our relationships with food. Now, we will look ahead to later in life and how the rules are rewritten all over again. This is episode 20, Menopause, Metabolism, and the 8 p.m. problem. Hello and welcome back. Over the years, I've listened to so many women describe a similar experience about how when they realized their bodies and minds started to feel a bit unfamiliar to them. They talked about how the same things that they used to do didn't work any longer. The way they ate, exercised, the way they managed stress, how they lost weight, how they built up strength in their bodies, how they could push through exhaustion or handle basically everything on their plate. It felt like all the rules changed. Everything was completely different. And I think maybe the most frustrating part is that many of us women are left asking the same questions. What changed? Why does my body feel like it stopped responding to me, to everything that I had always known and done is no longer working? If you've already gone through perimenopause or menopause, you probably know the cultural story we are often handed the moment our bodies begin to change. Somewhere around midlife, most women hear a version of, maybe not as strongly, but you've let yourself go. Maybe it's implied. You've stopped trying. Or you just need more discipline. And because that message is everywhere, many women assume the answer must be going back to what worked before. That makes sense. The workouts, the eating patterns, the strategies that we used in our 20s and 30s. What's so incredibly frustrating about that, about those messages, is that the same input no longer creates the same output. But instead of asking what changed inside our bodies, we often ask ourselves, what am I doing wrong? That is one of the most damaging pieces of conditioning women carry in this stage of life. It treats a hormonal transition as a discipline problem. It asks us women to solve a biological shift with grit and mind control, which is like using your old house key in the lock of your new home. You keep doing it over and over again. And then you finally realize, oh, this key doesn't work in this lock. But what's truly happening is much closer to having a second kind of puberty. It's a system-wide renegotiation of hormones, brain chemistry, metabolism, muscle, sleep, and energy regulation. It arrives on its own time, regardless of how disciplined or healthy or consistent someone has been for the previous 20, 30 years. The body is operating with a different set of instructions. The problem is that we were most likely not told about the rules being changed. Instead, we are often trying to handle it with the doctor prescribed eat less, move more, count every calorie. And if it isn't working, well, gosh darn it, try harder. That's a good philosophy, except the body's not asking for more punishment. It's simply asking to be understood. Because once you understand what's actually changing, the whole experience starts to make a different kind of sense. I think this entire episode might create a series of no wonder moments, such as, no wonder this feels different. No wonder what was working before stopped working. Or no wonder why my body feels like it changed the rules. So let's see what's happening inside the body that can make weight, appetite, and metabolism feel so different. Because a major part of that story starts with estrogen. Estrogen does far more than regulate reproduction. It communicates with systems throughout the entire body, including the brain, metabolism, and the pathways involved in hunger and fullness. As our estrogen declines through perimenopause and menopause, some of those signals begin to change. For instance, the systems that help regulate appetite and satisfaction may not communicate in exactly the same ways they did before. Hormones like leptin, which help signal fullness in your body, and ghrelin, which helps signal hunger, they're part of that complicated conversation. And we talked about that in the previous episode. As the hormonal environment changes, many women notice that the volume gets turned up on hunger and cravings, while satisfaction feels harder to reach. The result is not a failure of character or effort. It's the body responding to a new hormonal landscape. This same hormonal shift explains why fat often redistributes toward the abdomen during and after menopause. It's called visceral fat, and the increase in visceral fat is well documented and connected to declining estrogen. Visceral fat is different than just fat beneath the skin. It's the type of fat that sits deep inside the abdomen, and it surrounds organs like your liver or pancreas and intestines. It can have a huge effect on your metabolic health. Again, this is biology. It's the body adapting to a different set of hormonal signals. And those changes don't stop once menopause is over. Research following postmenopausal women found that hormones involved in hunger, fullness, and metabolism, including ghrelin and leptin, and something called adiponectin, continue to change alongside body weight for as long as 18 to 30 months after the menopausal transition. Ugh. That means that the body doesn't adjust once and suddenly settle into a new normal. It continues recalibrating, which means that a woman can be years into this stage of life and still feel like the body keeps changing. So let's talk about a few of those changes. This is a part of this episode that I think most of you will recognize. I call it the 8 p.m. problem. For me, there are so many nights right around 8 p.m. I feel the need to eat something, even though I just finished dinner less than an hour before. I need something sweet, salty, preferably both, right? And throughout this series, we talked about some of the reasons this can happen. I mentioned hyperpalatable foods, intentionally made with a combination of sugar, salt, fat, and enhanced flavors that activate dopamine pathways connected to reward, motivation, and wanting. These pathways can create a pull towards food even when you're not physically hungry. We talked about food noise and the difference between physical hunger and the constant mental chatter about food that you have in your brain. The planning and the negotiating, cravings, and thinking about food. It all happens because the brain has learned to connect certain foods with emotions, routines, and memories, and then that gives you comfort, pleasure, a reward, and sometimes relief. And the last one we talked about was the gut-brain connection, that constant two-way communication happening between the digestive system and our brain, brought on through hormones, nerves, and chemical signals. The brain receives the information about hunger, fullness, and energy, but it also interprets those messages alongside memory, emotion, and reward, which then influences how strongly we feel the pull towards food. And here's another layer to that conversation. What happens when that already complicated system enters menopause as the hormonal environment itself begins to change? I'll tell you. It's that heavyweight champion, cortisol, our primary stress hormone. In a well-regulated system, cortisol follows a daily rhythm of increasing in the morning to help us wake up and do our day, and then it gradually decreases throughout the day so our bodies can prepare to rest. Easy peasy, no problem. But you guessed it, perimenopause and menopause disrupts that rhythm. Why, you ask? Changes in hormones, increased stress sensitivity, eating patterns, and interrupted sleep all influence the way cortisol behaves. Instead of the body naturally shifting into rest mode at night, the system stays more activated than it's used to. But cortisol doesn't work by itself. It communicates with the same hunger and fullness signals we talked about earlier. But when sleep is disrupted or the body is under stress, the ghrelin and leptin also may shift. This can change hunger, cravings, and how satisfied we feel after eating. That's what's making me feel that I want to eat after 8 p.m. I have every intention of not eating for the rest of the evening after dinner. But my brain and my body seem to be receiving a little different memo. But your body doesn't feel like that's enough, right? To just not feel satisfied and want to eat all the time. There's more. It's more of a cycle, continuing. Hot flashes, night sweats, and disrupted sleep can make it all more complicated because poor sleep itself influences appetite regulation the next day. A rough night of sleep can change how hungry you feel, what food seems rewarding to you, and how easy it feels to make decisions around food before the day has even really started. That's another one of those no wonder moments for me. Sleep is one of the ways the body regulates the entire system. When your sleep is disrupted, hunger signals can become stronger. Fullness signals may become less effective. And then the brain's reward system can become more responsive to the foods that provide quick energy and comfort, aka hyperpalatable, ultra-processed, packaged foods. And at the same time, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control, decision-making, it doesn't function at its best when we're exhausted. The part of the brain trying to think long-term is competing with the body asking for immediate energy and relief. So the 8 p.m. problem is not always about that it's 8 p.m. Sometimes it's the result of hormones, stress, lack of sleep, and biology having this little conversation behind the scenes long before you ever open that refrigerator door. Be gentle with yourself. The next piece I want to spend a little bit more time on because it's something millions of women experience, and many have been told or have assumed that it simply resolves once menopause arrives. You may know this condition as PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome. This year, after years of research and much input from patients, clinicians, and researchers around the world, the condition was renamed to polyendocrine metabolic ovarian syndrome, or PMOS. I mentioned the name change because the reasoning behind it really matters. The old name focused on the ovaries and cysts, but the condition itself is much bigger than that. It involves multiple hormone systems, metabolism, and the way the body regulates its energy. PMOS affects roughly 1 in 10 women in reproductive age. That makes it one of the most common endocrine conditions amongst women. And for many years, the focus was on the reproductive systems, irregular cycles, fertility, and androgen-related changes. For me, the signs started with my first menstrual cycle. I had one and then didn't have another one for an entire year. After that, they were completely unpredictable. I started losing my hair and I gained weight that felt almost impossible to lose. When I was 17, my gynecologist put me on birth control just to manage the symptoms, but told me I should consider a hysterectomy. At 17. I've spent years dealing with hormonal fluctuations, what goes along with that, mood changes, irritability, anxiety, all while taking the earlier versions of the pill that were supposed to help with all of that. Years later, when more research about PCOS became available, I realized how grateful I was that I didn't have that hysterectomy, because it wouldn't have addressed all the underlying symptoms. Because PMOS doesn't simply disappear when menstruation stops. So taking out my ovaries wouldn't have helped. One of the biggest pieces of this story is insulin resistance. Insulin is the hormone that helps move glucose from the bloodstream into our cells for energy. A helpful way to picture that is insulin acts like a key and the receptor on each cell acts like a lock. I like my key lock analogies. With insulin resistance, though, that key does not work as smoothly as it should. So the body compensates by producing more insulin to get the message through. Higher insulin levels influence hunger, influence cravings, and how your body stores energy. This is where menopause can add another layer to it. Estrogen helps support insulin sensitivity. So when estrogen declines, women who are already dealing with insulin resistance may feel even more of a shift. For some women, perimenopause becomes the moment when weight changes and cravings and metabolic struggles suddenly feel louder, even if they had previously found a balance that worked for years. That was my experience. For years, birth control somewhat helped me manage some of the symptoms I was experiencing. But when I stopped taking the pill in my early 50s because the doctor said I had a higher risk of cancer, being on it, the more my symptoms increased. The message I received was that PCOS improves after menopause because ovulation stops. I had spent years researching this condition, including writing about PCOS and menopause in college. The research was showing a much more complicated story. The reproductive systems may change, but the metabolic challenges can continue or even become more noticeable. After stopping birth control, I noticed my body changed again. I gained more weight. I became pre-diabetic. I lost even more hair. And eventually I had to make it stop. And I called up my doctor and started speaking to her about hormone replacement therapy, or HRT, and could that help these symptoms? What could it do for me? What could it do against me? What could be the bad things that could happen? We discussed my family history and how strongly I felt about it. There is no cancer in my family, and so I did feel pretty strongly about taking it. She explained to me that the HRT that is currently used is much different than what our mothers took. So I decided to take it. That is my personal choice. I am not advocating for HRT whatsoever. I just know I started to take it, and it does help a small amount for my hot flashes and clarity. Like, I don't have that brain fog so much. So that's my claim to it. Only for me, not for anyone else. My doctor and I also discussed GLP-1 medications, including medications like Zepbound, becoming part of a menopause conversation. Zepbound, also known as tirzepatide, works a little differently because it activates two hormone pathways, GLP-1 and GIP. These are natural hormones involved in the communication between the gut, brain, and metabolism that help regulate blood sugar, regulate the insulin response, and help with your appetite and fullness. For some women dealing with PMOS, along with menopause and insulin resistance, these medications are not just changing appetites. They're influencing some of the same biological systems that have been part of the struggle all along. That's been part of my story as well. For me, it wasn't only about weight. I noticed changes in food noise, which I had spoken about, my hunger signals, my metabolic health, and how my body felt overall improved. My blood pressure improved. My sleep improved. And for the first time in a long time, the signals inside my body quieted down. Many women describe something similar. They say there's less food noise, fewer intense cravings, and a different relationship with hunger. Of course, medication, just like what I was saying about the HRT, GLP-1s, it's a personal medical decision that belongs between you and your doctor. I just know that if symptoms improve when a biological pathway is supported, that tells us that the body was asking for a different kind of support. So in talking about menopause in ways of metabolism, estrogen, hormones, and APM problems, we have to discuss the brain. What about your brain in menopause? Because the brain has estrogen receptors as well. And I think when the estrogen changes, the brain does notice. Neuroscientist Lisa Mosconi and her team at Weill Cornell studied how the female brain changes through the menopause transition. By using brain imaging, their study changed how we understand the relationship between menopause and the brain. For years, the higher number of women diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease was often explained through women live longer. And while lifespan does play a role, research suggests it doesn't explain the entire difference. One area scientists were studying is estrogen's relationship with the brain. Estrogen does much more than regulate reproduction. It also plays a role in how brain cells use the energy. During the menopause transition, there are changes in brain glucose metabolism, including in areas involved with memory and cognitive function. This is one of those facts that changes the way you look at the whole transition, because the brain itself appears to go through its own adjustment period. It also helps explain why researchers continue to study the relationship between hormone therapy and brain health. Some evidence suggests that starting hormone therapy closer to the menopause transition may have better effects than starting it later on. That's a complex decision that depends on each woman's health history, risks, and goals. Again, it belongs in a conversation with you and your medical provider. I just want to give you what the research is saying. So, whether or not HRT is part of somebody's story, understanding what happens inside that brain matters. Because some of the things that women have been describing for years, such as brain fog, trouble finding words, or feeling like their mind just completely works differently. We can't multitask. It starts to make more sense. For many women, these cognitive changes are temporary. The brain adapts to a different hormonal environment and finds a new way to maintain balance. This is where food enters the conversation again. Not because we need another list of rules, but because the brain is an energy-demanding organ. If we can support a stable energy through enough nutrients, protein, fiber, and balanced meals, it can make a difference when the entire system is trying to adjust. Research around brain health often points towards eating patterns like the Mediterranean or the Mind diet. Those foods emphasize rich in omega-3s, omega-3 fats, vitamins, fiber, and antioxidants. This podcast is not telling you what to eat. I'm just telling you what the brain food benefits are. There's not one perfect brain food, right? That fixes everything. But because the brain, like every other part of the body, needs support, trying to figure out what supports it helps with the transition. There's also growing interest in alternative fuel sources, such as ketones, supporting the brain during when glucose metabolism changes. Some early research, especially in people experiencing cognitive changes, is exploring that connection. Our goal is not to chase the next perfect diet. The goal is support. That's such an important distinction that you have to keep telling yourself. We're finally starting to expand the conversation around menopause and the experiences women have described for decades. They deserve to be studied. They deserve to be understood and taken seriously. And it's happening. It's starting to happen. Yay. So everything in this episode points back to the same reframe. The real question is not what's wrong with my body. The question is, what is my body adjusting to right now? Because before we can change the story we tell ourselves about what's going on, we have to understand the story our body's been trying to tell us. So much of this transition is happening beneath the surface, under everything. The hormones shifting, signals changing, and the system's adapting long before we fully understand what is happening. When we understand the biology, we can stop fighting the body and start learning how to support it. Next time, we turn from what the body is doing to the stories we have attached to what the body does. Episode 21 is food addiction, food shame, and the cheat day lie. That's all next time on the Original Self podcast. I want to thank you for spending your time with me. It means so much. And if you'd like to learn more about working with me, you can find all my contact information in the episode notes. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.